So, welcome to the Challenges in Forest Ecology once more for the month of April. So, today's speaker is John Healey. He's Professor of Forest Sciences at Bangor University. John is well known for a range of subjects. He's well known for his work on temperate forestry. He's well known for his work on tropical forestry in all kinds of systems, particularly agroforestry systems. I think probably if I was to think of John Healey, I would think tropical straight away. Um, his work is well published. He's another person that needs almost no introduction in our series. Another one of our prestigious speakers. He has an H factor of 57. His work's been cited over 10,000 times. So quite remarkable career. John's today is going to talk about, it's got a long one, spatial temporal variation in Amazon deforestation and forest recovery, implications for the climate and biodiversity. It's one of the first ones we have that's very tropical. So John, your floor, great to see you. Thank you for coming. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Doug. Uh, I'm just going through the share screen palaver, and we'll start this up as a
Okay.
slideshow. And unless you or anyone else tells me otherwise, I hope you're sharing my screen.
Yep, looks good.
I shall see if I can select for myself a jazzy pointer. And here we go. Well, thank you very much indeed to all of you for attending this seminar. Um, Doug's giving me my title. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the huge Amazon biome and its notable environmental gradient from northwest to southeast, from wet to dry, close to the boundary with the Cerrado system. You'll also be um, well familiar with the rapid rate of economic development and human population expansion in the Amazon, with an increasing network of roads penetrating further and further, as well as towns and other infrastructure. And this is very much associated with high levels of disturbance, not least fires, particularly concentrated in the prolonged droughts that are occurring with the increasing frequency of El Nino Southern Oscillation years. I absolutely want to emphasize that all of the research I'm going to present to you today is that of Charlotte Smith, who completed her PhD as part of the Envision Doctoral Training Partnership led by Lancaster University, in which Bangor is a partner. And I was privileged to be one of the co-supervisors of Charlotte's work, but it is all her work I'm presenting here. Okay, to give you an overview of her methodology, she made use of a Brazilian map biomass data set, the most appropriate for this purpose, which classifies individual pixels between land cover classes on annual satellite images. And she was able to use the data from the first year of this data set, 1985, for most of the analyses up to 2017, a 32-year period of annual images. And she was able to calculate the transitions of each pixel between land cover classes in successive years. For instance, a pixel that was classified as forest in one year would most often remain as forest with no transition in the following year. Similarly, a pixel that was classified as pasture land in this case may well remain as pasture land in the following year. However, and what of course we're concerned about, is that on some occasions, a pixel classified as forest may transition to be classified as pasture land. On the other hand, an area that had been pasture land, of course, the next year may have the reflectance that shows it to be classified as forest, which by definition would be secondary forest on this occasion. And the following year and subsequent years, that pixel may again be classified as forest, going through secondary succession, increasing biomass, carbon stocks, biodiversity as increasingly old secondary forest. On the other hand, at any point in time, that secondary forest may be cleared, revert back to pasture or cropland, etc. So a whole series of these and many other increasingly complex matrix of transitions. So using this simple analysis, here is the map that Charlotte produced as reported in this paper for the Amazon biome as a whole, where of course we have the old growth forest defined here as the land that remained classified as forest throughout the whole about 32-year period. And most of it would have been old growth forest of much greater age than that. There was much lower rates of conversion of forest before 1985. That's the dark green. She was able to separate that from the pale green shown here along the Amazon River, particularly in the east and parts of the south of the Amazon. This is land that at some stage since 1985 had been shown as cropland or pasture land, but by 2017, that year was now classified again as forest, secondary forest. And we can see the same thing in this small area of Para here, the blocks of old growth forest with quite a high cover of secondary forest around these blocks, sometimes connecting them together, and so on. So what might be of more interest is to look at the net result of this analysis across the whole of the Amazon. So I have the area here in 10,000s of square kilometers. In the dark blue bars here, annual bars, we have the rate of gain of secondary forest in each successive year through that transformation of the pixels. On the other hand, we have the pale blue bars below the line of the rate of secondary forest loss, sorry. Just say that again. So the blue bars above the line are the gain in secondary forest following its regrowth after agriculture, but the pale blue bars below the line are the secondary forest that's lost, that was deforested again. So the red line here is the net change in secondary forest area in each year. And we can see, arguably encouragingly, that in every year apart from the year 2000, there was actually a net increase in the area of secondary forest. The Amazon is becoming more and more occupied by secondary forest less than 32 years old. Another way that this analysis can be applied is to look at what the land use was before this land reverted to secondary forest, before the agriculture was abandoned. So in this graph here, we have a pasture land shown as the dark blue bars, the cropland shown as the open bars, and the pale blue is the overlap between them. They're kind of shown as overlapping bars. And we have here the cumulative curves for each of those two respective land use types that occurred before the secondary forest regrew. And we have the area of secondary forest that regrew after different durations of agricultural land use. And we see that the median duration of land use before abandonment, leading to the start of secondary forest regrowth, was only 2 years for cropland and just 5 years for pasture land. So during this period, there was a very rapid rate of transition and abandonment of much of the land where agriculture had been started. Another way that these data can be used is to look at the forest that was secondary forest in 2017 and how many cycles of clearance for agriculture, abandonment, and secondary forest it had been through during that 32-year period. And we can see that the majority of the secondary forest in 2017 was growing on land but had only been cleared of forest once during that period. But in a few areas, it had been up through as many as 5 different cycles of secondary forest agriculture transition. So, leading to the title of the talk, I'm going to show you, first of all, in a spatial sense, one part of Charlotte's analysis to start to look at the implications of these dynamics in terms of carbon stock changes and carbon emissions. So I'm going to show you in this first slide how we reported the data in this paper, which was making a geographical comparison across the Amazon countries and the different states in Brazil. And it's where things were by 2017, summing what had happened during those 32 years, done on a matrix of 60 square kilometer grid cells. So first of all, we have the loss of carbon from old growth deforestation. And the way Charlotte's mapped it here is for each of these 60 square kilometer grid cells is to plot or to calculate the percentage of the original carbon stock that had been in that forest that had been emitted due to deforestation of the old growth forest during this period. And we can see in the high deforestation areas in the east and south of the Amazon and a bit in the west that it was getting up to a really high proportion of the original carbon stock. There was virtually no forest left. It had all been deforested. I'm just going to interrupt myself for a moment in case you're seeing this Zoom notice on the screen, and I'll just see if I can remove it if that makes it a bit less distracting for you or for me. Okay, and I shall attempt to recover my pointer again. Apologies for that interruption. Okay, so that's the amount of carbon stocks that have been lost due to deforestation expressed in these terms and how they map across the Amazon. And Charlotte was then able to map the occurrence of secondary forest, as we previously looked at in previous slides, on the same grid cell resolution. And also using the method I've described in earlier slides, up to 32 years, she is able to map the age distribution of the secondary forests with a lot of younger secondary forests in the south and east of the Amazon, a greater proportion of older secondary forests along the river Amazonas, Solomonas, and in the interior of the Amazon. And so the bottom line is the carbon recovery. To what extent have these carbon losses due to old growth deforestation been offset by secondary forest regrowth? She was using modeled data of the rate of carbon loss due to deforestation from previous studies, as well as the models that have been fitted of the carbon stock accumulation with age of secondary forests to produce this map here. And so again, for each of these 60-kilometer square grid cells, she's showing what proportion of the old growth deforestation in over the 32 years in that pixel is being recovered by secondary forest growth. And again, reflecting the secondary forest age map, it is along in the interior of the Amazon where there's more recovery, whereas in the real deforestation frontiers, there's only a few places where secondary forest growth is recovering any reasonable proportion at all of the carbon losses due to deforestation. Moving away from the mapping to look at the whole Amazon data, this is the kind of real bottom line component of this, if you like. So just to take you through the color coding here, the mid blue bars here are in each of these 32 years, the amount of emissions in gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent due to deforestation of old growth forest, and the pale blue bars above them are the additional losses due to deforestation of secondary forest, whereas the dark blue below the line are the extent to which they've been offset by secondary forest regrowth in each year. Expressing that as a single line in the graph, over this 32-year period, the Amazon had lost, getting on for 13 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions due to old growth forest clearance, due to deforestation. And the offset due to secondary forest regrowth only reduced that by 9.4%. So here's the bottom line. 10% is better than nothing, but it's only 10% of these emissions have been offset by secondary forest regrowth. The next part of Charlotte's study I'm going to talk to you about is making this more spatially explicit, the more sort of landscape ecology component of this. And I'm going to walk you through this really nice diagram Charlotte put together, explaining, citing empirical published studies of the whole range of effects that the relative spatial position of old growth forest, deforestation, and secondary forests may have. So first of all, for a patch of old growth forest, where it has an edge that's adjacent to deforested land, cropland, pasture land, whatever it might be. There's a whole lot of effects from that deforested area impacting the old growth forest, reducing its carbon stock due to disturbance and so on, causing structural changes, changes in the microclimate, drying effects and so on, increased fire risk, and all of that shown to have an impact on species abundance. On the other hand, if an old growth forest has adjacent to it an area of secondary forest of whatever age that might be, there are some mitigating effects from that boundary. It will lower the rate of tree mortality compared with the deforested edge. It will reduce the intensity of microclimate changes, and it's been shown to decrease the extent to which fauna avoid the edge. They're more willing to use as habitat edge that's adjacent to secondary forest. And there's then the inverse of that. What's the impact of adjacency to old growth forest on the recovery of secondary forest? It's been shown to lead to faster rates of biomass recovery, increased quantity and diversity of seed rain, and with that, increased genetic diversity across animal and plant populations. And the other important effect that Charlotte looked at is how the presence of secondary forest between patches of old growth forest may reduce their fragmentation, increase their connectivity, and that's been shown to increase species diversity. So an overview of her method, which we reported in this paper. She started off with a land cover map into three categories. The grey cells here are showing non-forest, the agricultural land. The dark green is showing the pixels that are classified as old growth forest, and the pale green with two on there, the secondary forest, using the same classification I talked about before. The first thing she did is she created a binary map between forest and non-forest in order to map each isolated forest fragment. And so we have here 4 forest fragments in this illustration here. And then she combined that with the three-way classification to separate out the components of each fragment that were old growth forest, shown as 1, or secondary forest, shown as 2. So for these 4 fragments, this one is secondary forest only, this one a mixture of secondary old growth only, and this one mixed. And she was also able to then carry out the sort of fragmentation analyses to identify connected versus isolated secondary forest, and indeed old growth forest as well. So applying that, here again is a map figure for the whole of the Amazon. The number of old growth forest fragments, the grid cells here are 56 square kilometers each. In A here, the old growth forest. So this is showing the number of fragments, of isolated fragments in each 56 square kilometer grid cell. And in the east of the Amazon, along the river, we have a huge number, even up to 150 isolated fragments in each grid cell. Whereas in the less deforested part of the Amazon, it may all be just one continuous forest cover, just a single fragment. What happens then in B when you allow the secondary forest to connect the fragments? You can see here the colors are much darker. We still have the odd place, which has a huge number of isolated old growth forest fragments, but in much of the area, the yellows have gone purple, and we have many fewer fragments in each grid cell because of this secondary forest connectivity between them. So secondary forest does greatly reduce fragmentation, reduces the isolated old growth forest fragments by 2 million, which is a huge number. Of course, it's across the whole Amazon, but this has major potential benefits for biodiversity. So looking at these data graphically, this is the number of fragments in millions across the whole Amazon if we just look at the old growth only and ignore the secondary forest. If we add in just the older secondary forest, more than 15 years, it reduces it from 3.3 million down to 2.3 million separate fragments. And so that's reduced the number by 30%. If we go all the way through to include any secondary forest of any age, it's reduced the number of fragments by as much as 60%. Another way this analysis can be used is to show the size of each fragment in rather confusing units here of 10,000 square meters. Of course, that's still much less than a square kilometer, but this is the fragment size in 10,000 square meters. Old growth only, there's about 45,000 square meters is the median size of each of those fragments throughout the Amazon. And as we add in just older secondary forest or all secondary forest, then it's increased the median fragment size by 80% from 4.5 to 8.1 times 10,000 square meters. Next, let's look at the buffering of old growth forest edges. So in this graph here, we have the area of secondary forest, in this case in 1,000 kilometer squares. And for every fragment of a secondary forest, we are looking at its distance to the nearest edge of old growth forest, shown separately in these distance categories. By far the tallest bar is secondary forest that's within 120 meters of an area of old growth forest, and this is the cumulative curve, of course. And what this is showing is that 41% of secondary forest is directly adjacent to old growth forest, or at least within 120 meters of it, though these are mostly patches of highly fragmented old growth forest. Looking at this in a slight, bringing another variable in, using this kernel density estimation, we can classify, well, classify each pixel according to what its old growth forest cover is. So these are the pixels here which have a high cover of old growth forest. Down at this end, those with a very low cover of old growth forest, a largely deforested area. And this is looking at it from the other way around, from the perspective of the old growth forest, how much of its edge is buffered by any secondary forest. And what we see here, it's just by coincidence, it's a similar number, but 41% of old growth forest edge as a whole is buffered by any secondary forest of any age. But what we do see is that in the areas of the Amazon which have suffered a high rate of deforestation, this very dense kernel here shows a much lower percentage of the old growth forest that's remaining is actually buffered by secondary forest. So that's more concerning, as shown by the bright red of that label there. So this is showing that the areas that are heavily deforested, there's much less mitigation of this fragmentation by secondary forest. And that's even more dramatic if we confine ourselves to buffering by older secondary forest. It's more than 15 years old. But overall, it reduces it down to across the Amazon as a whole, just 23% of old growth forest was buffered by secondary forest of this age. And of course, it's down to well less than 10% in the grid cells that are in highly deforested areas. So the final piece of Charlotte's work that I'm going to tell you about had as its sort of baseline the fact that there has already been a lot of research carried out on the overall impacts of deforestation, of complete conversion of forest in the Amazon and elsewhere on biodiversity. So Charlotte wasn't just going to repeat that. Instead, she was tackling the challenge that much less is known about the effects of spatial and temporal dimensions of deforestation and about the effects of degradation of remaining forests on biodiversity, whether that's degradation caused by logging or by fires that still leave a forest cover afterwards. So the question she asked is, to what extent has forest degradation and fragmentation compounded habitat loss for disturbance-sensitive species in the Amazon? And this part of her work is available in her thesis, which is accessible from the Lancaster University website. But I do stress that having finished her PhD and started a new job and so on, Charlotte hasn't yet managed to publish this important part of her study in peer-reviewed literature. So it's in the public domain, but we're still hoping that a publication will result from it. Okay, so the broad approach that she took is first of all an Amazon biome-wide estimation of habitat availability for bird species that differ in their sensitivity to disturbance. And she then using very much the same methods I've been describing, but for a slightly different window of 35 years, combines spatiotemporal components of forest cover change, the edge effects, fragmentation, secondary forest recovery, with structural disturbance data sets of logging and fires, which she hadn't used previously. So the methods, just as we've seen before, mapping old growth, old secondary forest and young secondary forest using the map biomass data, as I've described. Then as a new component, using the same data set, mapping for each fragment of forest, its proximity to a non-forest edge, applying a buffer of 60 meters or 300 meters. Then to bring in this disturbance data, she used the dataset of Bullock et al., published in 2020, where they mapped the occurrence of fires and logging disturbance, the so-called structural disturbance in the Amazon. So the Amazon basin as a whole, with the black here showing the pixels that are forest cover. But then we have two new garish colors here. The pale blue here are the pixels that were mapped as being highly degraded by human activity, those still forest, or by some kind of intense natural disturbance. So that's the degraded forest. And in the bright pink here, the areas that have suffered complete deforestation. And then taking one of these areas in Pará state in detail, here we can see on a scale of 50 kilometers here, the pattern, the spatial patterning of a complete deforestation. See it very much associated with roads penetrating the forest here and close to the river and access there. And this large swathe here of land that had been degraded, burnt or logged, but not yet completely deforested. Next, and I'll take a bit of time to walk you through this classification. She classified all the sort of known Amazonian bird species into 6 groups based on site-specific empirical studies and expert knowledge, and several of the most renowned experts on Amazonian birds and even co-authors of this study, and how these different groups of species respond to deforestation and disturbance. So that's based on defining suitable habitat for each group based on forest type, minimum distance from edge, structural disturbance, habitat fragment size. So here we go. Group A are those that are most tolerant of disturbance and degradation. They'll occur in any old growth forest or indeed any secondary forest. They don't mind using habitat right up to the forest edge or habitat that's severely structurally disturbed. And they've been observed to occur in fragments as small as 0.1 square kilometers, such as a Coraya wren here. Next group, little less tolerant, but still very tolerant. They'll occur in old growth forest, or in this case, just older secondary forest, more than 15 years old. But again, they'll use forest right up to the forest edge or structurally disturbed. And again, they occur in very small fragments, such as the forest Elenia here. Next up, this is a less tolerant group. They will only occur in old growth forest, not in secondary forest. But they don't mind using habitat close to the edge or disturbed forest, but they are only found generally in habitat patches more than 0.5 of a kilometer squared, such as the Amazonian barred wood creeper here. And the last 3 groups, really a much less tolerant type of species, such as the chestnut-belted gnat eater. Don't know where its gnats occur to be eaten, but anyway, it will only occur in old growth forest, again, not in secondary forest at all. And it is not found in habitat within 60 meters of the forest edge, or indeed habitat that's been structurally disturbed in the last 10 years. Again, only in habitats bigger than 0.5 kilometers. The penultimate group, really very sensitive to disturbance, such as the ringed ant pipit. Again, only in old growth forests, not within 300 meters of an edge or in recently disturbed forest, and it needs patches of more than a square kilometer. And finally, the most sensitive group, including the highly endangered black-winged trumpeter, largely a terrestrial bird, old growth forest only, won't occur within 300 meters of the forest edge or forest disturbed in the last 20 years, and only in much larger habitat patches could there be a viable population. Okay, so there are the 6 groups from A most tolerant of disturbance, to F, least tolerant. And then applying those criteria from the ornithological expertise, Charlotte calculated the size of habitat patches in each grid cell, matching those different combinations of criteria required by each group, their so-called available habitat area. And here are some of the results. So this is the estimated habitat availability for disturbance response groups in the Amazon biome from that least sensitive group A through to the most sensitive group F. And that's how much habitat was available in 1985. And that's that reduction in overall cover of Amazonian forest by the year 2020. And this is by 2020 how much remaining habitat there is in forest area in millions of square kilometers for each of these 6 groups. And the numbers, if you can read them inside the bars, are the percentage change reduction, loss of 9% of the previous habitat 35 years ago for Group A, whereas Group F had lost 40% of its previously available habitat, and shown in relative to the 2020 values in brackets there. So if we look at it from the perspective of the most sensitive group, F, like all the other groups, it had lost habitat due to deforestation. These are forest birds, but it had lost a whole lot of more habitat due to structural disturbance, the edge effects, the minimum habitat area requirements, and the combinations of those, and so on. So it had lost 40% of its habitat during like 35 years, even though 83% of the total forest cover was still present in the Amazon. And 80% of its losses are due to these additional factors, these fragmentation and disturbance of factors, rather than just pure deforestation. So here again, looking at in mapping terms for each of these species response groups from A to F, the percentage of habitat that remains by 2020 in 60-kilometer grid cells here. And for the least disturbance group, there's least disturbance sensitive group, there's large areas of the Amazon which still look like suitable habitat for it. Whereas for the most sensitive group to deforestation and degradation, it had lost any appreciable habitat in huge areas of the Amazon. So for the least sensitive group, just as we saw in the previous graphs, it had lost 9% of its habitat area during this period. And this is the 40% loss of the most sensitive group. This situation becomes even more acute for the subset of species that are very restricted in their overall geographical range, biogeographical range in the Amazon, such as several of the Group F species, which were particularly confined to this so-called Belen area of endemism. But in fact, there are some species where really this part of the forest in the state of Belen is really the only place they occur on the planet. So they are especially vulnerable species. And take you through the color coding here. This is the remaining habitat for this group F, these highly sensitive species, but it's inside a designated protected area, or in pale blue outside a protected area. Boundaries of the protected areas shown with the red lines here. So what we see is despite this area, Belen, retaining 67% of its forest cover after those 35 years, just 9% of the habitat required by this group remains in this highly deforested part of the Amazon. And 87% of its remaining habitat is in these protected areas. So the proportion of the forest is protected, but the protection is enacted and achieved without encroachment, which of course is a major governance challenge in the Amazon, depending on other political and economic factors, is absolutely crucial for the conservation of these highly sensitive bird species. So here is exactly the same data that I showed you for the Amazon as a whole, but confined to this Belen area of endemism. And if we focus, I mean, all the species have lost a lot of habitat because it's a high deforestation part of the Amazon, but the situation is especially acute for the Group F species. So all the species have lost a third of their habitat, forests are gone, but adding in these fragmentation effects, and for the most disturbance sensitive group, just 9% of their habitat remained in just a period of 35 years. Bit of a despondent final set of data to show you, but let's move to some conclusions. So the positive point is that there's a lot of secondary forest regrowth. Whether that will still be the case with more high input soybean cultivation, if that is a more sustainable form of agriculture, remains to be seen. But anyway, over the period of a study, there's high potential resilience of Amazonian forests through good potential for natural recovery of secondary forest following clearance if climate and disturbance regimes permit. However, secondary forests are subject to repeated clearance, so are only offsetting less than 10% of the carbon emissions caused by deforestation across the Amazon. Yes, they're mitigating, but only to a small extent. Plus point, secondary forests may be playing a bigger role in biodiversity conservation by greatly reducing fragmentation and buffering edges of remaining old-growth forests, so that spatially explicit analysis, the importance of place is key, and more of that is needed in conservation planning and policy. But all of these benefits are vulnerable to potential forest ecosystem collapse through this nexus of climate change, deforestation, and fire, and just what's happening with this increasing frequency of intense El Nino events. And the final set of conclusions is the critical importance of forest condition and configuration for disturbance-sensitive Amazonian bird species, degradation, fragmentation, and so on. So they are the principal drivers of habitat loss for the most sensitive species. And they have lost across the Amazon 40% of their habitat during this 35-year period. And that species endemic to parts of the Amazon suffering high rates of deforestation and degradation are at especially high risk. And that will be even more acute if these protected areas are threatened by lack of appropriate governance. And there we are.
Great. Thank you very much, John.
Shall I
So,
stop sharing screen or leave it on, Doug?
uh, it's up to you. We'll leave it on just a second. Maybe you need to go backwards and forwards. So, excellent, really excellent. I would like to invite questions, and how we normally do this is we write them into the chat box, and we read them out. So, does anybody want to start? Otherwise, I will start. 2 seconds. No, then I'll start. Except I won't write into the chat box because I know what my question is. Um, in this agricultural land abandonment, first of all, why does this happen? Why is there an abandonment of the cleared land after such a short space of time?
Um, to an extent, that is a agronomic, ecological, soils issue you'd expect to hear, Doug. Because some of the land that's deforested, particularly if there's been a big loss of soil organic matter, if fire was used and got very intensive and so on, means that actually yield is dropping off quite rapidly, whether it be cropping, whether it be pasture productivity. I think, though, without getting too complicated about the politics of this, an awful lot of this is to do with the challenges of land tenure, of governance, and did the person who cleared the land have ownership or the right to do so? There's been a big shift with changes in Brazilian politics about the extent to which the forestry authorities and conservation agencies have enacted the rules, the laws in terms of if people have been clearing illegally, whether they are actually prevented from carrying on farming that land, or whether there are disputes over ownership, and so on. I won't begin to open it up, apart from I just try to explain to you there's always complexity of governance and law enforcement or lack of it, and so on. But I think as we look at the trade-off against food production, and we might could get into a whole argument about the pros and cons of high intensity soya production in the Amazon, but that's been a big trend towards the end of that period, and our agronomist colleagues and crop breeders have made huge progress, for better or for worse, here. And so you are getting this trend towards Amazonian land being taken over by much better capitalized farmers with big international commodity markets. Next time you eat your KFC and pride yourself from not eating the meat of a ruminant, you're eating a chicken instead with lower methane emissions. Just think about all the soya that that chicken was fed and where it was grown. Um, because there is this trend towards arguably, though we will see more sustainable agriculture in the Amazon, which is producing more food per land area, but might just encourage more encroachment into the forest when people see the profits to be made.
Okay. And then the next one is in the carbon balance. If you put soils into it, what happens then?
I thought I should turn that question over to you,
No,
Doug. I mean,
I
the
can begin to
the
answer
the
it, but
the I mean, the models that are used do attempt to include below ground as well as above ground carbon stocks, but I did use the word attempt
Mhm.
intentionally. Often it's done by the so-called expansion factors and so on, and the research you've carried out for much of your career and so on would point to evidence about the source of inaccuracy that is. But I think we just don't know how big a source of error it is, and I'm not going to speculate on the extent to which the loss of soil carbon is underestimated or overestimated, but I think there's a serious risk that it is being underestimated.
Okay. There seems to be a problem. You can hear me, John, right?
But not very well.
Ah, okay. I don't know what I can do about that in this short message. Um, hang on. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Better? Can you hear me now?
yes, you're a bit more echoey and distant, but a bit clearer.
Right, okay. Okay, there's a bit of a problem here. Okay, so I decided to chat box. Yeah. So sorry. Okay. The question. I have a question about the gain of secondary forest at the beginning of your talk. Each year, a significant area shows forest gain. What activities are driving this trend? Additionally, what tree cover thresholds did you use to classify land as secondary forest? You can see that as well, can't you,
I
John?
can, yeah, I've stopped sharing so that
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can see
Okay.
it and I don't have to rely on your voice, Doug. Um, okay, so the first part of that question. To an extent, I'd answered it already, but the gain of secondary forest is because during this 32-year period, there have been surprisingly high rates of abandonment of land from pasture in particular, but also from cropland, um, maybe just temporarily, but in many cases for a longer term than that. But the smallholder farmers who had been carrying out that activity just gave up. During much of that period, there had been high rates of migration to the Amazon of people from the south of Brazil and the east of Brazil who were effectively whether they had tenure or not, or whether they sold the land that they previously farmed, they lost access to it. They were destitute. And as has happened throughout human civilization or uncivilization throughout the years, people migrate to the forest frontier to land that may be government land, but no one's going to stop them clearing forest and farming it. But these smallholder, impoverished farmers have very little capital, high vulnerability to crime, to lack of capital, lack of access to healthcare, to markets, and so on. They're living on the margins, and very often may have decided this farming in the Amazon isn't working. I'll migrate my family to the town instead, go for a different livelihood, go back to the south of Brazil where I came from and work as a worker on someone else's land there, whatever it might be. So during much of this period, a high proportion of the farming was carried out by people who were really on the economic margins, and it was barely viable for them to do it. That's why much land abandonment, and then at that time, it was just left for forests to regrow. As I already said in my answer to Doug's question, that may be changing with this greater occurrence of industrialized, big scale, high capital agriculture taking place. The tree cover threshold, I can't answer that question. What I should be able to, but this is entirely to do with the map biomass data set. The Brazilian institutions that developed this applied their own classification and applied thresholds between it. And those are the data that Charlotte used after a careful search that it was the most reliable and suitable database. But it was not part of this study to apply that classification. We used the classification that had been done within that data set. So I apologize, I can't answer that better.
Okay, then we've got another question from Zoltan Nagy, which is what is the quality of a secondary forest compared to a primary forest? Can we call 15-year-old plants group forest again?
I laugh because I'm well aware of the huge arguments that have been not least within the FAO to enable their global forest resources assessment, their mapping of forest and so on. That question that we could all debate for the next hour about what is a forest, because it's very, very hard to decide what criteria to use. And are we simply being driven by what it's easy to map using satellite images? And is that really a very good biological or ecological basis for saying what should be considered a forest? Other studies that I've been involved with, the PhD, uh, different PhD student studies and so on, have looked at data from sort of chronosequence studies of the rate of accumulation of biodiversity during um, secondary forest regrowth. Some of you may know Geraldine Deroy, who works for Cirad Forêt in Guion Française now, her PhD. She did with us in Bangor here and in Montpellier. She did a meta-analysis of the rate of accumulation of biodiversity in drier neotropical forests and found that after about 100 years, not that as many data sets go that far, you were getting back towards the species composition. Let's not trouble ourselves about a measure of diversity, but the species composition of an old growth forest. So that kind of order of magnitude, but it does vary greatly from site to site. Clearly, a 15-year-old forest is very unlikely to have accumulated anything like the same species composition of plants or animals as an old growth forest. But as Charlotte's studies pointed out, there's great potential that where that secondary forest is growing adjacent to an old growth forest, the rate of recovery will be much quicker.
Okay, super. So the next question is, did you consider forest type, i.e. terra firma floodplain in the habitat availability graphs? I'm wondering if maybe species who are more sensitive to forest type may be even more affected by fragmentation than those that aren't as specific. That's a tricky one.
Um, well, it's not tricky in some ways because the answer is no, we didn't consider that. Um,
Okay.
but to be a bit more useful, I would massively acknowledge that this is a really important factor, but also say it's an extremely well, surprisingly unknown factor. And I've learned a great deal about this in the last 2 or 3 weeks, in fact, because my colleague in Bangor, Marielle Smith, fairly recently appointed lecturer in forest sciences as an Amazonian specialist. She and colleagues in various Brazilian institutions, Michigan State University, and so on, is carrying out really detailed characterization of the hydrology and the links to forest structure, comparing the tierra firma and the floodplain forests. Um, so looking at what is correlated with this variation in water table depth, and particularly how forests with different water table depths across this range, their vulnerability to drought events. And this is absolutely crucial and extremely poorly known now. Now, that's just in terms of a basic structural and ecophysiological characterization. I'm no zoologist. I couldn't tell you how many of these birds are fussy about whether they are in a floodplain forest or in a tierra firma forest. There are people who would know that better than me. But again, I would suspect that evidence is rather lacking.
Okay, great. There's no more questions in the box, but I just asked one. With these birds and the sensitivity of them to or the requirement of habitat size, does that fit together with abundance of them? I.e., are the groups A much more abundant than the group F?
Um, it's a really
The
good
second part to
question.
my question, before you answer that, maybe you can think about it. But this strikes me as possibly being a sort of a universal law in biology. Could you then say, well, actually, for tree species, it would be the same, that the highly abundant species are less worried about the habitat size than the rare species in terms of having a viable genetic population?
Mhm.
Sorry, that might be a bit tricky, but
No, it's a really good point. I wish I was more of a zoologist to be more confident in how I could answer it. But you said trees as well, so let's think about think about those. I'm sure they're not independent of each other, Doug. There is, from evidence from the UK as much as anywhere else, there is a classification of birds between those that are real forest habitat specialists versus those that are more generalists, is a word often used. And it's known, well known, that when forests are degraded, fragmented, and so on, it is the forest specialists, they may be the birds that are really sensitive to edges and degradation and so on. They're the ones that are hit worst. And the more generalist species that may actually quite thrive in a forest edge, be able to sort of nip out into the outer area outside the forest to do a bit of foraging out there, be they seed eaters or fruit, whatever they may be, and then nip back into the forest for a bit of shelter. They're the ones that are kind of more tolerant. So what I suspect occurs with this fragmentation and degradation is there's a shift in those abundance patterns. In the intact forests, then actually the forest specialists, in as much as these species are competing for the same resources, may be quite advantaged and have high population abundance relative to the generalists. But there's this shift not just in species composition, but also in relative abundance as we go to more fragmented forests, that the population size of the forest specialists goes down and down and down due to their various vulnerabilities and may dip below that viability level in a given fragment, whereas the generalists may stay the same or may even increase because they're actually benefiting from all of that additional edge habitat and so on. It doesn't exactly answer your question, but it's where I'll
very,
get
very
to.
good. Okay, then we're almost reached the end of our time. There appear to
Could
be
I
no other
also ask a
questions.
question?
So
Could I,
I do
could I
nothing more.
ask a
So,
question?
so look,
Oh,
Herbert,
Herbert, yes,
yes.
please.
Um, Did you consider also different degrees of land degradation? Because there may be quite a difference, between only clearing the land and letting it at its cleared stage, or doing some other land uses which are more degrading. Even, other land uses, like you are only focusing on agricultural uses, there may be mining and such things interrupting in the whole system, which can even have wider impacts beyond the pixel itself, you know.
Well, that's a very, very well-informed question on several levels. The straight answer is no, we didn't, and that's not because we were negligent, or perhaps no, it's just because of lack of available data. The whole of this study relies on accurate spatial mapping layers you can overlay on each other.
Mm,
And yes, it
mm,
is extremely well known in parts of the Amazon that gold mining and mining for other metals is having a catastrophic impact on water quality and on many other aspects of habitat quality for a wide range of taxa. But this, of course, it's a legal activity. Yes, it can be picked up in satellite imagery, but still problematic doing it. Sometimes it's
mm,
occurring below a forest canopy, though generally not with these open cast mining, and there's just a lack of available data. The one thing we could have done is to separately analyze cropland from pasture land because those two categories are separated in the map biomass data.
mm,
But essentially, they are two different categories of non-forest, and we thought that that complication wouldn't have added much value,
mm,
apart from what we looked at in terms of the duration
mm,
of previous land use. But as you say, there's so many different degrees and variations of degradation. But if it wasn't for the data set that was sufficiently spatially explicit that Charlotte got hold of from the 2020 paper by Bullock et al., we would have even struggled to carry out any analysis of degradation and natural disturbance, even as a single uniform category. But they
mm,
had
mm,
mapped that fairly accurately, but just as a single category. Um, with the increasing availability of LiDAR as well as hyperspectral imagery, and always extremely clever people who are massively focusing on these huge remote sensing data sets and the application of AI, this is advancing very quickly. So I think even now it would be possible to do much more to meet the point you made than was possible when Charlotte did this work 3 or 4 years ago. It's the data availability is becoming much greater, but we're talking about vast, complex data.
mm.
Shall we say thank goodness for machine learning or not? I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
One more time. So again, uh, thank you very much, John. Excellent talk. Very happy that you could do this. So, to those listening, again, thank you for coming. The next talk is in a month's time, which is Pauline Grierson from Australia, and she'll be talking about Karri Forest. So I think it's about in 1 month's time. It's the first Wednesday, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah,
So again, thank you very much,
yeah,
John. Thank you everybody for coming, and
thank you.
hopefully see you in a month's time. So bye
Thank
bye.
you.